Section 1. The phenomenon that breaks brains. There is something genuinely strange about the way human memory works when it comes to television. Not in a clinical, textbook kind of way, but in a deeply personal, almost intimate way. You watch something, you laugh at it, you feel something real while you watch it, and then years pass, and the thing you remember watching and the thing that actually aired start to quietly drift apart from each other, like two boats untethered on a still lake, moving slowly, almost imperceptibly, until one day you look over and realize they are nowhere near each other anymore. Family Guy has been on the air since the 31st of January, 1999. That is over 25 years of this show living inside the cultural memory of millions of people around the world. Over 25 years of scenes, jokes, quotes, characters, and moments being stored away in minds that were simultaneously trying to hold on to everything else life was throwing at them. School, work, relationships, other shows, other movies, other jokes from other contexts entirely. All of it pressing up against the Family Guy files somewhere in your brain, shifting things slightly, blending them with other material, reorganizing by emotional similarity rather than by date, until what you remember is a kind of composite, a mosaic made of real pieces arranged in a slightly different order than they originally existed in. That gap between what we remember and what actually happened has a name. It is called the Mandela effect, and the name itself comes from one of the most striking, documented examples of collective false memory in modern history. Large numbers of people around the world genuinely and confidently remembered that Nelson Mandela died in prison in the 1980s. Not vaguely, not as a passing thought they were not sure about. They remembered seeing news coverage. They remembered the funeral. They had detailed, emotionally specific memories of an event that never occurred. In reality, Mandela was released from Robben Island in February 1990 after serving 27 years, went on to lead the movement that ended apartheid, and became the first democratically elected president of South Africa. He lived and worked and gave speeches well into the new millennium and passed away in December 2013. The term Mandela effect was coined by a paranormal researcher named Fiona Broom around 2009, after she discovered that her own false memory of Mandela dying in prison was shared by an unexpectedly large number of other people who had independently arrived at the same wrong conclusion through completely separate paths. Over the years since that original naming, the concept expanded far beyond its political origin point. It now describes any situation where a significant number of people share a false memory of something, particularly when that something involves popular culture. Whether the Monopoly mascot always had a monocle, whether there was a cornucopia depicted on the old Fruit of the Loom logo, whether a beloved children's movie from the 1990s actually existed, whether Darth Vader's most famous line is phrased exactly the way everyone quotes it at parties. These false memories feel so real, so vivid, and so precise in their specific details that the natural reaction when you learn the truth is not simply to nod and accept the correction. The natural reaction is to feel genuinely, personally unsettled, because it is one thing to be wrong about a fact you were fuzzy on. It is a completely different experience to have a specific, confident, emotionally backed memory that turns out to describe something that never actually happened that way. Family Guy is a breeding ground for this phenomenon on a scale that very few other television programs can match, and the reasons for that go considerably deeper than you might first assume. Start with the most basic element, which is the sheer length of the show's run. Over 25 seasons of television production means thousands of individual scenes, hundreds of named characters, an almost incomprehensible number of cutaway gags that exist as standalone comedy units disconnected from the stories around them, and an entire universe of recurring jokes, running bits, and callback moments that evolved and changed continuously across decades of production. No human being can hold all of that in accurate, time-stamped detail. The volume of content creates structural pressure on memory. Scenes blend together across episodes. Episodes merge in recollection across seasons. A joke you encountered in Season 4 gets mentally filed under Season 2 because the earlier seasons feel more foundational, more iconic, more like the genuine core identity of the show. Then consider the circumstances under which most people actually watched Family Guy, especially in its early years. Sunday nights, often while doing other things, often in the background while you were also eating, also having conversations, also checking something else. Often late at night when alertness was already softening towards sleep, people were not sitting down with clipboards to fact-check continuity. They were absorbing the show in the casual, inattentive way that television gets absorbed when it is part of the texture of your evenings, rather than the center of deliberate attention. And what absorption of that kind keeps is impressions, feelings, and broad strokes. The exact wording of a line, the specific season a character appeared in, the mechanical details of how a scene unfolded. These are the things that fade while the emotional register stays. Third, and this is the factor that makes Family Guy uniquely vulnerable to the Mandela effect compared to most other shows, is the show's own complicated relationship with its internal continuity. Family Guy famously and deliberately reset itself between episodes as a matter of policy rather than accident. Characters experienced events in one episode that were never referenced again. Storylines were introduced and then abandoned without resolution. Major moments, including character deaths, were undone in subsequent episodes as though the earlier events had been erased. The show actively did not maintain the kind of narrative consistency that would allow a careful viewer to construct a reliable map of what had happened, and in what order. When the story itself is this fluid, memory has almost no framework to anchor corrections against. You cannot go back to a remembered scene and check it against the established canon, because the established canon was always shifting, always subject to revision, always willing to pretend a previous episode had not existed when a new episode needed to start fresh. The show gave its audience permission to be uncertain about its own history by being genuinely uncertain about its own history. And then layered on top of all of these factors are the cutaway gags themselves, which are the engine of the show's Mandela effect production in a way that is worth examining carefully. Family Guy built its entire comedic identity around the cutaway format, the device by which a character references something in passing, and the screen jumps away to a completely unrelated scene for a self-contained joke before cutting back to the original story. These gags are by definition untethered. They exist without context, without plot significance, without any logical connection to the events surrounding them. They arrive, they do their work, they leave. And things that arrive and leave without connection to anything around them are genuinely difficult for memory to accurately place. A cutaway gag from Season 7 can feel in memory like it belongs to Season 3, because both had similar emotional registers, because both featured similar voice performances, because memory files by feeling and association rather than by date. A cutaway from one episode blends with a cutaway from another because they shared a tone or a subject or a visual style. The floating islands drift together in memory's ocean and merge into something that resembles neither original precisely. All of these factors together explain why Family Guy has generated more false memories per hour of runtime than perhaps any other animated series that has ever been produced. And those false memories are worth examining at length, because they reveal something real and specific about what the show meant to people, which emotions it created at which moments, and which characters and scenes resonated deeply enough to lodge in the mind even when the specific details came out scrambled on their way back to the surface. There is also the internet dimension to consider, and for Family Guy specifically, this dimension is unusually significant. The show returned from its first cancellation in 2005, the same calendar year that YouTube launched. These two things grew up alongside each other in the culture. From the earliest days of online video sharing, Family Guy cutaway gags circulated as individual standalone units. Someone found a particular exchange funny, extracted the 30-second clip, posted it, and it gathered views from people who had never seen the episode it came from. A joke from Season 5 would be seen by someone who had no context for Season 4 or Season 3 or Season 2, and that person's understanding of the show would be built entirely from isolated moments rather than from the connective tissue of complete episodes. A memory built from clips is structurally different from a memory built from watching complete episodes. It is more vivid in specific moments and completely lacking in context. You know the joke perfectly. You have almost no reliable sense of what surrounded it. You cannot say with confidence whether it was Brian or Stewie who said something in the seconds before the cutaway began. You have no sense of which storyline the episode was following when the moment appeared. The clip lives in your memory as an even more isolated floating island than it was when it originally aired within an episode. When you then try to place that clip in a season or attribute it to an episode from memory, you are making an essentially intuitive guess that feels like recollection. And because the guess is anchored to real emotional memory of the clip itself, it carries the confidence of genuine remembering even when the contextual placement is entirely wrong. People who have the location of a scene wrong sound exactly as certain as people who have it right, because both are accessing the same kind of felt certainty. Over the course of this exploration, we are going to move carefully through every major category of Mandela effect that Family Guy has produced. The misquoted lines. The scenes that feel absolutely real but did not happen the way they are remembered. The character details that got blended and distorted over time. The episodes that people swear they watched but that do not exist or differ dramatically from what was actually broadcast. The moments everyone is certain happened one way, and the reality of how they actually went when you check. Get comfortable. Let the night settle around you. Close your eyes if you want. Just let the words come, and let the gentle, slightly disorienting pleasure of having your memories gently examined wash over you like a slow tide coming in. Drop a comment letting us know where in the world you are right now and what time it is where you are listening from. We genuinely love seeing who is tuning in from different parts of the planet at different hours. And if this kind of content is something you enjoy falling asleep to, subscribing is completely free and means you will always have something waiting. Section 2. The Stewie Griffin Memory Maze. Of all the characters in the Griffin household, and in Family Guy's extended universe of supporting players and recurring figures, Stewie is the one that most people feel the most personal certainty about. He is immediately quotable in ways that require no setup. He is visually iconic to the point where his silhouette alone is recognizable to people who have never watched a single episode. He has that unmistakable voice and theatrical manner that Seth MacFarlane built from a genuinely considered creative place, modeling the character's vocal performance on classic British actors of Hollywood's golden era, with Rex Harrison being the most frequently cited primary influence. MacFarlane has noted that Harrison's particular blend of exasperation, superiority, and barely suppressed menace was central to how he constructed Stewie's voice. People own Stewie merchandise and wear it with pride. They do Stewie impressions at social gatherings, sometimes quite convincingly. They have been quoting him in conversation for over 25 years. He appeared on t-shirts before the show even came back from its first cancellation. He is one of the most recognizable animated characters created in the last 3 decades, and people get him wrong, consistently. In some of the most interesting and revealing ways imaginable, the single most persistent Stewie memory distortion involves the British accent itself, which might seem surprising given how fundamental the accent is to the character's identity. A genuinely large proportion of longtime Family Guy fans will tell you, with full confidence, that Stewie's accent was always pure British throughout the show's run. Polished, consistent, never wavering from episode to episode or season to season. The accent of someone raised in a manor house, educated at boarding school, and thoroughly removed from any American regional influence. While that impression is completely understandable, given that his manner of speaking is so powerfully and consistently associated with British upper-class theatrical affectation, the actual vocal performance MacFarlane delivered across the run of the show is considerably more fluid than the memory of perfect British consistency suggests. In the very early episodes of Season 1, the accent drifts in ways that a careful listener can notice. American vowels occasionally surface. The performance in those earliest scenes is more accurately described as a highly committed theatrical approximation of British than as an authentic recreation of it. The inconsistency is not a performance flaw. It is a creative choice, and it works beautifully in context. Stewie is an infant living in Rhode Island who somehow speaks like a character from a period film. A slight wobble in the accent is part of what makes the joke land the way it does. The voice is clearly a costume the character is wearing, and like all costumes, it has occasional gaps where the person wearing it shows through, but memory smooths this out. People remember him sounding uniformly and perfectly British across all seasons because the idea of Stewie is the mental category they are working from, not the actual sound of the actual performance in the actual episodes. The conceptual shorthand, the internal poster image that stands in memory for the full, variable, living character. The real voice is more textured and more interesting than the remembered one, but the texture is the kind of thing that only registers consciously when you go back and listen specifically for it. The most famous line associated with the character is something that almost nobody quotes exactly correctly when they do it from memory. If you asked a large sample of Family Guy fans to say Stewie's most iconic declaration, you would get dozens of slightly different versions, all delivered with the same theatrical confidence, none quite matching the original. People commonly remember it with additional flourishes, extra dramatic words, and inflections slightly different from what was actually voiced. The actual line used throughout the early seasons was simply, "Victory is mine," delivered with Stewie's particular brand of theatrical self-satisfaction, but without the elaboration that memory tends to add. Memory loves to elaborate on things that felt dramatically significant, and so extra words appear in the recalled version, extra intensity gets layered in, and what comes out of people's mouths is something subtly but genuinely different from what originally aired. What the Deuce is another case study in how the strength of a character association generates false memories of frequency. People connect this phrase to Stewie so completely that it feels like something he said constantly, in nearly every appearance, across dozens of seasons. Some fans will tell you it became repetitive, that they heard it so often it lost its surprise. In reality, the phrase is absolutely associated with Stewie, and he did say it multiple times across the early seasons, but the actual frequency was never what collective memory suggests. The association between the phrase and the character is so strong and so total that every instance of hearing it feels like confirmation that you have heard it countless times before, which inflates the perceived count significantly. The association generates false frequency. The world domination storyline timeline is where fan memories diverge in specific and revealing ways. Ask someone when Stewie stopped being primarily a villain, when the evil genius plots began fading out and the more emotional, personally exploratory version of the character took over, and you will hear a wide range of confident answers spanning almost the entire broadcast history of the show. Some people say the shift happened almost immediately, that even in season 1 there were clear signs of the softer Stewie beginning to emerge. Others say the evil genius persona lasted deep into the show's middle period, with the change only fully evident in season 8 or 9 or later. Both positions are misremembering in opposite directions, but both feel entirely certain to the people holding them. The reality is that the transformation took place across a range that most people's memories compress or skip over. The heavy emphasis on world domination schemes and explicit plotting against Lois was primarily concentrated in seasons 1 and 2. Season 3 maintained the villain premise while already spending more time on emotional texture, on Stewie's relationship with Brian, on the character's interior life beyond his stated goals. Season 4, after the 3-year break and revival, was where the writers made a conscious decision to shift the character's direction, having determined that they had explored the evil baby concept as fully as they wanted to. Season 6's two-part story where Stewie apparently achieves his lifelong goal and then has everything revealed as a simulation served as a kind of unofficial farewell to the original version of the character. By season 8, the Stewie on screen bore relatively little resemblance to the season 1 Stewie in terms of his storylines and motivations, even though his voice, his look, and his manner of speaking remained continuous. The question of whether other characters could understand Stewie throughout the show's run is one of the most genuinely layered areas of false memory in the entire series, because it involves not just a misremembered detail, but a misremembered rule about how the show's world worked. The stated premise in the early seasons was clear. Most adult characters heard Stewie babbling when he spoke. They processed him as a normal baby. Brian was one of the few characters who could genuinely understand Stewie and have real conversations with him, which was part of what made their friendship feel special and set it apart from Stewie's other relationships. This created wonderful comedy in the early seasons, where Stewie would deliver elaborate, detailed, menacing speeches about his plans for world conquest, while Lois calmly asked if he wanted more of his bottle. The dramatic irony, where the audience knows everything and the parent knows nothing, was a core source of humor and felt like one of the show's genuinely clever structural choices. Over the course of the show's long run, this rule was applied with increasing inconsistency. There are numerous scenes scattered through the middle and later seasons, where characters who theoretically should hear babbling clearly respond to specific things Stewie says in ways that only make sense if they understood the words. The rule was not abandoned formally. It was simply applied whenever it served a scene's comedy and set aside whenever a different approach served better. The inconsistency accumulated across seasons to the point where the original rule existed mostly as a reference point for self-aware jokes rather than as an actual operating principle. Memory resolves this inconsistency by committing to one version or the other based on which era of the show a particular viewer experienced most. People who watched primarily the revival and later seasons remember Stewie as being universally understood because that was effectively the operative version of reality in the episodes they saw most. People who watched primarily the original seasons remember the misunderstanding premise as absolute and consistent because that was the stated premise, and it was followed more faithfully in those years. Almost nobody accurately holds the messy, uneven middle ground of the actual show, where the rule was honored selectively and abandoned whenever a scene needed something different. Rupert the teddy bear deserves particular attention in the context of how memory handles the character's evolution. Most fans remember Rupert as having been absolutely central to Stewie's characterization from the very earliest episodes, a constant presence, a defining emotional relationship, one of the most important elements of who Stewie was as a character. The image of Stewie with Rupert feels like a founding image, something that belonged to the show's original premise. In the actual episodes, Rupert is present in the early seasons as background detail, visible in scenes, occasionally referenced, but not carrying the specific emotional weight that the relationship would develop in later seasons. The bear becomes significantly more central to Stewie's characterization as the show increasingly explored his personal emotional interior and his need for connection during the middle and later seasons. The version of the Stewie-Rupert relationship that feels most fundamental to who Stewie is as a character was developed over time rather than established in the beginning. Memory takes that fully developed version and backfills it into earlier seasons where it had not yet been built to that degree, because the later version feels so essential that it must have always been there. There is also a very common false memory centered around a specific feeling that many fans carry, the sense that at some point in the show, Stewie actually succeeded at something significant in a way that stuck. Not in a dream, not in a simulation, not in an alternate timeline that got erased. Actually, permanently, within the main story of the show. This memory is persistent and specific even among people who understand intellectually that the show used reset buttons. It seems to emerge from the emotional weight of the Season 6 two-parter, where the events of Stewie finally achieving his lifelong goals felt so dramatically satisfying that the simulation reveal at the end of those episodes did not fully take hold in memory. The brain kept the victory. The brain set aside the reveal. And so a significant number of people carry around a version of the show's history that includes a Stewie triumph that only ever existed within a simulation on his own computer. This is one of Family Guy's most consistent and most interesting memory-distorting habits, presenting dramatic events at full emotional intensity and then undoing them. The events leave impressions in the brain at the intensity at which they were experienced. The undoings arrive more quietly, more as plot mechanics than as emotional experiences, and they simply do not print in memory with the same depth. The map of Family Guy's story that most people carry is populated with events that felt real, preserved as if they were real, even when the show explicitly told viewers they were not. Stewie's friendship with Brian is remembered with warmth and accuracy in terms of its emotional texture, but the specific moments within it are frequently misplaced across seasons and episodes. The Season 8 episode where the two of them are accidentally locked in a bank vault overnight and spend the entire episode talking with unusual honesty about their lives and fears is often remembered as having occurred considerably later in the show's run than it actually did. It aired in May 2010. The episode functions as though it were the product of a much longer, more deeply established relationship, and this quality causes memory to push its date forward to a period when the show would have had even more history to draw on. The Road 2 episodes are remembered as a continuous series with a generally consistent quality across their entries, which is accurate in broad terms. What gets scrambled is the content of individual episodes within the series. Things that happened in one entry get remembered as happening in another. Emotional moments from one get attributed to the adventure story of another. The general quality of Brian and Stewie's adventure chemistry is correctly held in memory. The specific episode-by-episode content has been blended into a composite that does not precisely match any single episode that actually aired. Section 3. Brian Griffin and the Shifting Dog. Brian Griffin's place in the landscape of Family Guy Mandela effects is uniquely complicated, and the complication flows directly from the gap between who he was when the show began and who he became as the seasons accumulated. In seasons 1 through 3, Brian was the character that the largest portion of the audience was meant to identify with most closely. He was grounded where everyone else was unstable. He was perceptive where everyone else was oblivious. He was the one who could look at whatever chaos was occurring and respond the way a reasonable person would respond, with dry observation, with mild exasperation, with a sarcastic comment that landed because it was accurate. He was Peter's best friend, Brian's anchor to the world, and the emotional steady point around which many scenes organized themselves. He was also a fully realized character with genuine personal struggles. The unfinished novel, the complicated feelings toward Lois that he kept carefully controlled most of the time, the drinking that was present but textured, a character detail rather than a punchline, the way his intellectual aspirations sometimes exceeded his actual achievements in quiet, recognizable ways. He was, in those early seasons, something close to a real person, flawed and trying, and that is a rare and valuable quality in an animated character. Because of how completely and strongly viewers identified with that early Brian, there is an intensity of emotional investment in how he is remembered that shapes the memory distortions around him in very specific ways. Memory of Brian is not neutral, it is partisan. People remember him the way they want him to have been, which is mostly the way he was in the beginning, and they extend that remembered version further forward through the show's history than the actual character's arc supports. The most widespread Brian-related memory distortion is about the timing of his character's shift away from likability. Ask fans who watched the show throughout its run when Brian became difficult to root for, and you will hear a consistent range. Season 8, Season 9, somewhere in that period is the common consensus answer. Season 7 might be offered as the last season where he was still mostly good. Season 10 as the point where it became undeniable. This general positioning is not entirely wrong, but it places the beginning of the shift later than the actual episodes support. In seasons 4 and 5, after the revival, Brian's political views start occupying significantly more screen time. His opinions shift from being one ingredient in a complex characterization to being an increasingly dominant feature. His sense of intellectual superiority, which in the early seasons was expressed with enough self-awareness to be amusing, begins losing the self-awareness and becoming something straighter and less interesting. By season 6, a careful watcher can already see the early form of what the Brian of season 9 would be. The drift is gradual, which is precisely why any individual episode still felt like a Brian episode, but the direction of travel was established earlier than most memories place it. Memory delays the beginning of the shift because memory wants to preserve the beloved version for as long as possible. The early Brian is cherished. The later Brian is frustrating. Rather than accurately marking when the transition began, memory compresses the transition period and pushes it closer to the point where the character became obviously difficult, which feels more consistent with the way the quality of beloved things is supposed to deteriorate, suddenly and clearly, rather than gradually and deniably. Quagmire's speech in Season 8 is among the most specifically and most richly documented moments in the show's later history in terms of what it was and what it was supposed to accomplish. The episode Jerome is the New Black aired in November 2009 and featured an extended, carefully constructed speech in which Quagmire explained to Brian, in exhaustive and precise detail, why he could not stand him. The speech was clearly written with awareness of how the audience was feeling about Brian. It named one by one the qualities that made him insufferable, the gap between his self-image as an intellectual and his actual accomplishments, his persistent pursuit of Lois in front of Peter, his hypocrisy about his own behavior while criticizing others, his failure as a father, the pretension that covered an absence of genuine achievement. Every item on Quagmire's list was backed up by actual events from the show's own episodes. It was not an exaggeration. It was a precise accounting. The memory distortion around this speech is specifically about what happened after it. The speech is correctly remembered as real, devastating, and clearly endorsed by the writers as the truth about where the character had arrived. What is incorrectly remembered is the aftermath. A very large number of viewers carry a memory in which the speech produced some kind of change in Brian. A period of humility, an arc of adjustment, some evidence that the words had landed and that the character had been, at minimum temporarily, reformed by the experience of hearing his own faults named so precisely. The actual episodes that followed Jerome is the New Black do not support this memory. Brian's behavior in subsequent episodes was not meaningfully changed by the speech. His arrogance continued, his hypocrisy continued. His treatment of people around him continued and in some cases became more extreme. The speech diagnosed a problem clearly and memorably. It did not solve the problem. It was acknowledgement without consequence, which is a pattern the show used repeatedly in its later seasons, identifying its own failures through the mouths of characters while not actually doing the work of addressing them. Memory cannot easily accommodate acknowledgement without change, because it is a structurally unsatisfying narrative. A speech that devastating and that precise is supposed to be the beginning of something. Memory decides it was the beginning of something because that is the shape it needs to have in order to feel like it meant something. Brian's death and return in Season 12 has been written about at enormous length in discussions of the show, and the cluster of false memories around its specific mechanics is one of the densest concentrations of Mandela effect in the entire series. The facts are documented with unusual clarity because the event was covered by mainstream news outlets, generated a massive response on social media, and occurred in the age of easily verifiable broadcast records. In the Season 12 episode, Life of Brian, which aired the 24th of November, 2013, Brian and Stewie had set up a street hockey net in the street in front of the Griffin house. Stewie went back inside to retrieve his knee pads. While Stewie was inside, a car traveling too fast came around the corner and struck Brian. He was taken to the veterinarian in critical condition. The family gathered. Brian, before dying, told the Griffin family that he loved them and that they had given him a wonderful life. He died. The episode introduced Vinny, a new dog for the family voiced by Tony Sirico, in the same episode. 3 episodes later, on the 15th of December, 2013, Stewie encountered an alternate version of himself who still had a working time machine, borrowed it, traveled back to the moment before Brian was struck, and prevented the accident. Brian came back. Everything returned to normal. The first major distortion around this event is in the mechanics of Brian's death itself. The car hitting him is accurately remembered. The staging of the scene is frequently wrong. Some people remember Stewie as having been present on the street and watching the accident happen directly, rather than coming out to find Brian already injured. Some remember the driver as a named or identifiable character. Some remember Brian as having been doing something active when he was hit, rather than simply being in the street near the hockey net. The emotional weight of the scene is preserved in memory with accuracy. The physical specifics of how it unfolded are routinely misremembered because the emotional experience of the scene was so overwhelming that the mechanical details were not registered with precision. The timeline of Brian's absence is another area of consistent and interesting distortion. He was absent for 3 broadcast episodes, approximately 3 weeks of airtime. Memory handles this in one of 2 ways, with very little middle ground between them. Either memory compresses the absence into something almost trivial, a barely there gap, which leads people to say the death never really counted because Brian came back immediately, or memory stretches the absence into something much longer than it was, with some people genuinely believing Brian was gone for several months or even a partial season. 3 weeks of a main character's absence was a genuinely significant experience for viewers, watching week to week in late 2013, who had no guarantee of the outcome during those 3 weeks. The online petition for Brian's return gathered over 100,000 signatures within 72 hours of the death episode airing. That level of response reflects a real, felt experience of loss, not a trivial inconvenience. But in retrospect, 3 weeks becomes either nothing or something much larger depending on the emotional framework the viewer is working from when they remember it. The reception to Vinny is another area of memory simplification. People remember Vinny as having been received with uniform, immediate, total rejection by the fan community. This is close to accurate in terms of the broad emotional temperature of the response, but it smooths out a more nuanced reality. Tony Sirico's voice performance was recognized even by critics who were unhappy with the situation as bringing something genuinely specific to the role. The episode that explored Vinny's backstory and his grief over his own previous owner's death was considered reasonably well constructed. Vinny was not beloved, but the texture of how he was received was not as flat as the unified "we hated Vinny" memory suggests. Brian's relationship with his novel is something that operates in memory in a very specific way across the show's history. The image of Brian as a sad, self-deluding failed novelist who claims to be a writer while producing nothing of value is one of the most settled characterizations in how people remember him. This image is accurate for the middle and later seasons. In the early seasons, the novel was background texture, mentioned occasionally to make Brian feel like a character with a life beyond his scenes, but not the target of the sustained, escalating mockery it became later. Memory projects the later version of this characterization backward because the image is so settled, so clearly what Brian is, that it must have always been that way. Section 4. Peter Griffin and the Mountain of Misremembered Mayhem. Peter Griffin is the loudest, most physically present, most visually dominant character in the show. He is in essentially every episode. He is the center of most storylines. He is the character from whom the most comedy flows. In the earliest seasons through his lovable idiocy, and in the later seasons through his increasingly extreme behavior. You would think that all of that omnipresence would make him the most accurately remembered character in the series. He is not. Peter Griffin is reliably, consistently, fascinatingly misremembered, and the pattern of how people get him wrong tells you something specific and true about what the show actually was versus what people wanted it to be and what it originally promised. The chicken fights between Peter and Ernie the Giant Chicken are the single most universally cited example of what the show did best at its peak, and they are among the most specifically misremembered set of moments in the show's history. Almost everyone who knows Family Guy knows about the chicken fights. The general premise, a recurring feud between Peter and a giant anthropomorphic chicken that erupts into elaborate, action movie choreographed battles that cause massive collateral destruction and last far longer than any narrative justification could support, is correctly remembered. The cause of the original feud, that Ernie had given Peter an expired coupon, is fairly well known and reasonably accurately recalled. What is reliably wrong is the timing of when these fights began and which version of them established the iconic format. A very large number of fans will say Season 1 when asked. Some will say early Season 2. The emotional association between the chicken fights and the early, beloved, foundational period of the show is so strong that memory places them in that period regardless of whether that is accurate. The actual history involves a first encounter in the Season 2 premiere, Da Boom, which aired in September 1999. This fight did happen, but the version of the chicken fight format that people are actually remembering, the extended, choreographically elaborate, clearly parody of action cinema style that the bit is famous for, was established in Blind Ambition, a Season 4 episode from the revival year of 2005. That is the fight that set the template. That is the version that all subsequent entries in the series were modeled on. The iconic form of the chicken fight is a post-revival creation, belonging to the year the show came back after 3 years away, rather than to the original run. This matters because it illustrates something precise about how memory relates to the show's golden era mythology. The emotional weight of Seasons 1 through 3 as the foundational, best period of the show creates gravitational pull. Anything strongly associated with what made the show great gets pulled backward in memory toward those years, regardless of when it actually appeared. The chicken fights feel like they belong to the original show, so memory places them there. The number of chicken fights that occurred across the show's run is another area of consistent false memory. Ask people and you will get answers spanning a wide range, from 4 to 12 or more, all delivered with equal confidence. The actual count depends partly on what qualifies as a full fight versus a shorter appearance by Ernie, and different sources count differently. The uncertainty about the number is itself a Mandela effect. People are certain there is a specific, correct number that they know, and they are confident in different specific numbers simultaneously. The fights exist as a cultural unit in memory rather than as individually recalled events, and cultural units are counted impressionistically. Peter and Lois's relationship is one of the richest areas of sustained memory distortion across the show's entire run, and the distortion operates in a very specific direction. Memory consistently remembers the relationship as warmer and more genuinely affectionate than the actual content of most seasons supported. The early seasons genuinely earned the warm impression. Episodes regularly ended with Peter acknowledging he had been wrong and coming back to Lois with something close to sincerity. There was real affection in their dynamic, even when the comedy around it was broad. The family felt like a family that loved each other despite everything. This early warmth is accurately remembered, and it is remembered with genuine fondness. The distortion is in how far forward memory extends that warmth. People remember Peter and Lois as fundamentally loving toward each other for considerably more seasons than the show actually maintained that dynamic. By the middle seasons, their relationship had become substantially harsher. Peter's behavior toward Lois had crossed lines that made the affectionate framing increasingly strained. The warmth was still invoked occasionally, but the baseline of how they treated each other in daily episode interaction had shifted significantly. Memory extends the early warmth because it is the version of the relationship that was established, that felt true, that made the show worth watching. The later erosion of that warmth is felt as a deviation from the real version rather than as the real version itself, and so it does not get updated into the permanent record in the same way. The "you know what really grinds my gears" bit is one of the clearest examples of cultural circulation inflating a gag's perceived frequency in the show itself. The format, Peter addressing the camera in the style of a talk radio complaint segment, appeared in episodes and became identifiable as a recurring bit. The phrase entered common usage outside the show, appearing in conversation, in online writing, on social media, in radio segments that deliberately referenced it, in countless contexts that had nothing to do with Family Guy. This sustained cultural presence over years and years created a sense that the phrase was an absolutely constant feature of the show, almost a weekly occurrence. The actual number of episodes where this segment appeared as a proper set piece is considerably smaller than the cultural footprint suggests. Memory does not distinguish between exposure to a reference in the show and exposure to the reference in culture. All instances of encountering the phrase feel like memories of the show, which makes the show feel as though it used the phrase far more often than it did. Peter's physical comedy and its relationship to the animation style of different production periods is an area where memory and reality diverge in ways that are subtle but genuine. The early season's physical comedy had a specific quality that came from the looser, more hand-drawn quality of that period's animation. Peter falling down, bumping into things, engaging in exaggerated reactions, all of this had a visual energy that came from a slightly rougher but more expressive style of movement. The later season's physical comedy was technically more polished, but sometimes less specifically funny, because the animation style had become more settled and precise in ways that reduced the happy accidents and loose energy of the earlier work. Memory of Peter's physical comedy exists as a composite that blends the early energy with the later polish, creating a remembered version of how he moved and reacted that does not quite match any specific era's actual visual style. People who go back and watch early episodes after years of watching later ones are sometimes surprised by how different the movement feels. People who go back and watch later episodes after long immersion in early ones notice how much the energy has changed. The remembered Peter moves somewhere between the two. Section 5. The Cutaway Vault of Misremembered Comedy. Cutaway gags are both the engine of the show's identity and the primary mechanism through which its Mandela effects are manufactured. By design, a cutaway is the most isolated possible unit of comedy. It exists without narrative context, without consequences for plot or character, without any logical tether to the material around it. It arrives, occupies its moment, and departs. Things that arrive and depart without anchoring are profoundly difficult for memory to accurately place in time and context. The result is a collective archive of floating gag memories that exists in the fan community, where specific cutaways have been assigned to the wrong seasons by 5 or more years, blended with other cutaways into hybrid remembered scenes that no single episode actually contained, and occasionally remembered as having endings or variations that do not match anything in the actual broadcast. The Conway Twitty gag is the single richest example of this at scale, a specific running bit whose actual history and frequency in the show have been so thoroughly distorted by memory that almost no casual fan accurately describes how it actually worked. The essential facts. Conway Twitty was an American country music artist who held the record for the most #1 singles on the Billboard country charts until George Strait surpassed him in 2006. Conway Twitty died in June 1993. The running gag that Family Guy built around his memory involved Peter turning to the camera and announcing, "Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Conway Twitty," after which the show cut to actual archival footage of Conway Twitty performing one of his songs at full and unedited length, often running for over 2 minutes before returning to the story. There was no punchline, there was no twist. The joke was entirely in the discomfort of the gap between expectation and delivery, the audience waiting for something to happen, while a country music performance from decades past played out completely. The first clear example of this gag in broadcast Family Guy was in the Season 5 episode Bill and Peter's Bogus Journey, which aired in March 2007. Seth MacFarlane later acknowledged that he was not in the room when the writers first put together the concept, and explained that Conway Twitty was selected because his particular performance style and era created a specific kind of productive discomfort when placed in the Family Guy context. The sincerity of the performance, its total disconnection from the show's usual register, was the source of the comedy. The gag appeared a limited number of additional times across subsequent seasons, each appearance generating debate about whether it was a legitimate comedic statement or simply time being filled. The show even had in-universe characters acknowledge the gag's exhaustion, with a god character eventually telling Peter to stop using Conway Twitty, which was the show's self-aware acknowledgement of the bit's accumulated weight. Memory turns this limited number of appearances into something that seemed to happen nearly every week, that dominated whole stretches of seasons, that was a constant presence for years. People who watched the show during its broadcast run remember the Conway Twitty gag as something they encountered constantly. This is almost certainly a product of the gag's impact being disproportionate to its actual frequency. Something that generated enough conversation, enough debate, enough memorable discomfort to be discussed and referenced in fan conversations across years inevitably gets remembered as having occurred far more often than it did. The impression was large. Memory inflates the frequency to match the impression. The Road to episode subseries occupies a specific and interesting place in the memory landscape of the show. Beginning with Road to Rhode Island in Season 2 and extending across multiple entries through the show's run, these episodes followed Brian and Stewie on adventure trips that removed them from the Griffin household and placed them in various settings, sometimes fantastical, sometimes grounded in specific historical or geographic contexts. They were consistently among the most warmly received episodes of whatever season they appeared in, and the collective memory of them is correspondingly positive. The specific content of individual Road to episodes is reliably confused between entries, however. Something that happened in Road to Germany, the time travel World War II episode from Season 7, gets remembered as having occurred in Road to the Multiverse from Season 8, or vice versa. The emotional moment from one gets attributed to the setting of another. The general feeling of Brian and Stewie's adventure chemistry is accurately held. The episode-by-episode content has been blended into a composite road to experience that does not precisely match any single episode. Road to the Multiverse in particular is an episode around which a specific and widespread false memory exists. Many fans remember it as having been presented as a special production, a longer-than-usual episode, an event in the way that certain particularly ambitious television episodes get treated as events when they air. It was not. It was a regular-length Season 8 episode that aired during the normal broadcast season. The concept was ambitious enough, visiting multiple alternate reality versions of the Family Guy universe, including a Disney animated version and a Flintstones-era version and others, that it feels in memory like something the show would have given a special presentation to. The ambition generates a false memory of special status. There is a broader phenomenon around cutaway memory that is worth naming explicitly. The way that certain cutaways exist in memory at a higher resolution than the episodes they came from, because those cutaways circulated online as standalone clips, while the episodes containing them rarely circulated in the same way. A 30-second cutaway that got shared and reshared and memed across years is more vivid in memory than the 20-minute episode surrounding it, even though the episode was experienced first and more completely. The clip has been reviewed and referenced more often, which means its details are sharper in recollection. The episode exists as a vague surround, a slightly blurry context, while the clip is crystal clear. This creates a very specific kind of memory confusion when people try to recall where a famous clip comes from. They can describe the clip in precise detail. They cannot accurately describe the episode. They guess at the episode based on the emotional register of the clip and the general sense of when the show was doing things that felt like that, and their guess is frequently wrong by multiple seasons. The South Park criticism of Family Guy's writing, which appeared in the two-part season 10 South Park episode Cartoon Wars in 2006, is worth mentioning in this context because it shaped how a generation of viewers experienced and remembered Family Guy's cutaways. The South Park episode depicted Family Guy's jokes as being generated by manatees randomly selecting idea balls to combine, arguing that the cutaway format required no actual craft or intentionality. The joke was pointed and received seriously by many viewers. For people who encountered that South Park episode, it created a frame through which Family Guy cutaways were subsequently experienced and subsequently remembered. Watching a cutaway with the belief that it was randomly assembled changes the way the cutaway registers emotionally, which changes the way it is stored in memory. The gag that might have been stored simply as a funny moment becomes stored as a funny moment that might be random, and that qualification affects how it is retrieved and described years later. Section 6. Deaths, Returns, and the Continuity That Never Was. Family Guy's relationship with death across its long run has generated some of the show's most persistent and interesting Mandela effects, and the specific way these false memories organize themselves reveals something precise about how the brain handles reversals of emotionally significant events. The show's casual, recurring practice of using major dramatic events and then undoing them created an audience that learned over many seasons that death and permanence in this fictional world were unreliable concepts. Characters who died came back. Events that seemed definitive turned out to be simulations, alternate timelines, or dreams. Major changes to the status quo were regularly reset. This learned uncertainty about whether anything in the show's story had real consequences affected how viewers processed and stored dramatic events. The specific memory pattern that resulted is consistent. The dramatic event leaves a deep impression in memory at the emotional intensity at which it was experienced, while the reversal or undoing of that event registers more quietly and sometimes fails to update the memory record of the original event. The brain keeps the death. The brain drops the resurrection. The emotional experience of the thing happening was more intense than the emotional experience of the thing being undone, and intensity determines what memory preserves. Meg Griffin and false memories of her having been seriously and permanently harmed are worth discussing specifically. Meg was never killed off in the show's main narrative timeline, but there is a meaningful number of fans who have a vague but persistent sense that something extremely bad happened to her that lasted across multiple episodes. This false memory appears to be generated by the cumulative emotional weight of the mistreatment she received across so many seasons. The show's sustained campaign against the character was intense enough and long enough that memory sometimes codes it in the same category as more dramatic, single-event harm. The Season 10 episode Seahorse Seashell Party, in which Meg finally confronts her family about how they have treated her, only to ultimately take back everything she said and accept her role as the family's outlet for frustration, is an episode that people remember very strongly in terms of its emotional impact, but with significantly varying accuracy about exactly what was said and by whom. Meg's confrontation speech is correctly remembered as having happened. The specific arguments she made are often elaborated in memory beyond what the episode contained. The specific moment where she takes it all back, and Brian explains to her that she serves a stabilizing function for the family, is correctly remembered but is sometimes recalled with different framing, as though the episode was more critical of this dynamic than it actually presented itself as being. The Season 6 Stewie two-parter remains the single most significant example of memory keeping the dramatic event and losing the reveal. Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie aired as a two-part story in which Stewie apparently shot Lois, left her for dead on a cruise ship, and went on to achieve global domination, including establishing himself as a dictator and creating a world remade in his image. The second episode showed what living under Stewie's world government was like, and eventually revealed that a restored Lois was alive and coming for revenge. Then, the simulation reveal. Everything was running on Stewie's computer. None of it was real. Status quo restored. The simulation reveal was a legitimate creative choice. It was a genuine subversion. But it was precisely the kind of information that memory is poorly equipped to hold on to against the vivid, exciting, emotionally resonant events it was designed to negate. Memory kept the world domination. Memory kept Stewie finally achieving his stated purpose. Memory kept the drama and the excitement and the feeling of something actually happening in this show that never usually let anything actually happen. The simulation reveal arrived more quietly, as a plot mechanic, and it simply did not print in memory at the same depth. A genuinely large number of people who watched those episodes remember Stewie as having actually killed Lois, at least briefly, within the show's real story. They remember it as a real event that then got reversed, rather than as something that was always designated as a simulation. The distinction seems trivial to describe, but generates very different memories of the show's history. Character deaths among the supporting cast created their own landscape of uncertain memory, partly because the show's treatment of these deaths was inconsistent in ways that made it difficult to track which were permanent and which were not. Characters appeared as ghosts after dying. Characters died in alternate universe episodes that were explicitly non-canonical. The concept of permanence in a show that treats continuity this loosely became genuinely unstable over time. Diane Simmons, the news anchor, is remembered as having been a more constant and prominent part of the show's fabric than her actual episode count supported. She was a reliable supporting presence for many seasons, which creates a strong sense of her being central to the show's world, but her actual storyline development and her death in Season 9 are frequently placed later in the show's history than they occurred. The death itself and its specific circumstances are often misremembered because the escalating storyline that led to it felt, to people watching it, like something that could not really be happening to a character as background level as she had previously seemed. Section 7. The quote graveyard. Nothing in popular culture generates Mandela effects more reliably than famous lines, and Family Guy has produced more widely circulated, widely misquoted dialogue than perhaps any show that has ever aired. The structural reason for this is embedded in how the show's comedy fundamentally works. Family Guy's humor is precision-dependent. The exact wording of a line matters enormously. A joke that works because of specific word choice, a particular rhythm, an unexpected word at the end of a clause, becomes a different joke or no joke at all when the words are changed even slightly. Yet the process of a line entering cultural circulation almost invariably involves some degradation through repetition. Someone quotes it from memory on a forum and gets 3 words wrong. Someone sees that version and quotes it from there with 2 more words changed. Someone uses it in a meme with slightly adjusted text to fit the format. Someone makes a video reference using a paraphrase. By the time a line has been in active circulation for 15 years, the most commonly encountered version of it may be meaningfully different from what was actually spoken in the original episode. The Stewie victory declaration has been discussed in terms of the specific line itself being misremembered with added flourishes. What adds further complexity is the surrounding moment. People place the line in contexts it did not originally appear in, remember it as a response to specific events that were not the actual trigger, and associate it with visual images from different scenes than the ones where it actually occurred. The phrase itself survives the circulation process relatively intact. The context it belongs to does not. The giggity catchphrase in its various forms is perhaps the single most universally misquoted element of the show. Ask people to demonstrate the catchphrase, and you will get different renditions from every person, each delivered with complete confidence. How many times does the word repeat? Is there a following word? Is there a preceding word? Is the inflection rising or falling? The answers vary widely across people who all believe they are quoting the same line correctly. This is partly because the catchphrase genuinely appeared in various forms across various episodes, sometimes with repetition, sometimes without, sometimes with trailing words, and sometimes without, making it functionally impossible to identify a single canonical version. But it is also because the phrase is so strongly associated with Quagmire as a character type, so completely reducible to the idea of Quagmire, that people feel they know it perfectly while not having registered its specific details. The association with the character is so total that precise accuracy feels unnecessary and is not pursued. The Godfather exchange from season 4 is a case where a specific phrase entered cultural currency and survived that process relatively intact, while everything around it blurred. Peter's observation that the Godfather insists upon itself became a widely used critical phrase applied to all kinds of media. Seth MacFarlane later noted publicly that the phrase came from something his college film history professor said about the sound of music, which was the original context in which MacFarlane encountered it. In Family Guy, it appears in the context of the Griffin family being trapped in a room filling with water, which is a significant piece of context that is almost never recalled by people who reference the line. The surrounding dialogue, what exactly each family member says in response, the specific back and forth that the phrase is embedded in, is routinely remembered differently by different people. The famous phrase itself travels accurately. The episode it lives in does not travel with it. Shut up. Meg has left the show so completely and become so thoroughly a piece of general cultural vocabulary that it now exists in memory largely independent of Family Guy for a significant portion of the people who use or recognize it. People who have seen perhaps 1 or 2 episodes of the show recognize the phrase and associate it with Peter and Meg. People who have watched the show extensively sometimes cannot place a specific original scene for it because the phrase has become so disconnected from any single moment. It belongs to the show in a general way rather than to any specific episode. The phrase's origin in the show's history is harder to pin down than people expect. It was not a season 1 invention. It was not a formal catchphrase from the beginning. It developed as part of the escalating Meg mistreatment in the post-revival seasons and became more prominent and more explicitly formulaic as that mistreatment became more consistent and more extreme. Memory places it in the earliest episodes because it feels foundational, but its development as a recurring verbal dismissal is a product of the show's middle seasons rather than its beginning. The Cool Whip pronunciation bit is remembered as considerably more extended than it was in its original appearance. The sequence, from the season 5 episode, Barely Legal, in which Stewie repeatedly and deliberately mispronounced Cool Whip with an exaggerated aspirated H sound while Brian tried to correct him, was quick and efficiently constructed. Memory of it has expanded it into something more like a long set piece. This expansion is partly because the bit appeared again in subsequent episodes with variations, creating a composite memory that combines multiple instances into one extended remembered scene in which the argument continues for much longer than any individual appearance actually ran. The Bird is the Word song sequence from Season 9's episode I Dream of Jesus is one of the clearest examples in the show of a clip having a memory life completely separate from the episode it came from. The sequence, in which Peter became obsessed with Surfin' Bird by the Trashmen and played it repeatedly at increasing volume throughout the episode, circulated as a standalone clip and became one of the show's most shared and referenced moments online. People who know the clip often have essentially no memory of the surrounding episode's plot, which involved Peter finding Jesus at a record store. The episode and the clip exist as separate memory items for most of the people who know the clip at all. Section 8. The Ghost Episodes. Every long-running show eventually generates a mythology of episodes that people remember watching, but which either do not exist or exist in dramatically different forms than remembered. Family Guy, given all the factors discussed earlier in this conversation, has accumulated more ghost epi. The phrase is embedded in, is routinely remembered differently by different people. The famous phrase itself travels accurately through the years. The episode it lives in does not travel with it. Shut up. Meg has left the show so completely and become so thoroughly a piece of general cultural vocabulary that it now exists in memory largely independent of Family Guy for a significant portion of the people who use or recognize it. People who have seen perhaps 1 or 2 episodes of the show recognize the phrase and associate it with Peter and Meg. People who have watched the show extensively sometimes cannot place a specific original scene for it because the phrase has become so disconnected from any single moment. It belongs to the show in a general way rather than to any specific episode. The phrase's development in the show's history is harder to pin down than people expect. It was not a season 1 invention. It was not a formal catchphrase from the beginning. It developed as part of the escalating Meg mistreatment in the post-revival seasons and became more prominent and more explicitly formulaic as that mistreatment became more consistent and more extreme. Memory places it in the earliest episodes because it feels foundational, but its development as a recurring verbal dismissal is a product of the show's middle seasons rather than its beginning. The cool whip pronunciation bit is remembered as considerably more extended than it was in its original appearance. The sequence from the season 5 episode Barely Legal, in which Stewie repeatedly and deliberately mispronounced Cool Whip with an exaggerated aspirated H sound while Brian tried to correct him, was quick and efficiently constructed. Memory of it has expanded into something more like a long set piece. This expansion is partly because the bit appeared again in subsequent episodes with variations, creating a composite memory that combines multiple instances into one extended remembered scene in which the argument continues for much longer than any individual appearance actually ran. The Bird is the Word song sequence from the season 9 episode I Dream of Jesus is one of the clearest examples of a clip having a memory life completely separate from the episode it came from. The sequence, in which Peter became obsessed with Surfin' Bird by the Trashmen and played it repeatedly at increasing volume throughout the episode, circulated as a standalone clip and became one of the show's most shared and referenced moments online. People who know the clip often have essentially no memory of the surrounding episode's plot, which involved Peter finding Jesus working at a record store. The episode and the clip exist as separate memory items for most of the people who know the clip at all. Quagmire's giggity catchphrase in its various forms is almost universally misquoted with respect to how many times the word repeats and whether other words accompany it. Ask people to demonstrate it, and you will get different renditions every time, all delivered with complete confidence. The reason is that the catchphrase appeared in various forms across various episodes, sometimes with repetition, sometimes without, sometimes with trailing words, and sometimes not. There is no single, definitive canonical version to point to, which means there is no authoritative standard against which to measure accuracy. Everyone's version is simultaneously not quite right, and as right as any other version. The victory is mine versus victory shall be mine. Distinction is small but persistent. People reliably add shall when it is not in the original line, because shall feels more theatrical, more appropriate to the character, more tonally correct for Stewie. Memory in this case is applying a logic about what fits the character to alter the actual wording of what the character said. It is a charming form of error, in its way. The brain is trying to make the quote better, more perfectly Stewie than the show managed to make it. The Stewie line, "What the deuce?" is accurately remembered, but its precise context is almost never correctly placed. People remember that Stewie said it, remember the tone of exasperated theatrical outrage it carried, but consistently misidentify which episodes contained its most prominent appearances and what specifically triggered it in those scenes. The phrase has become so thoroughly representative of a mode of Stewie's expression that it floats free of any specific narrative anchor and lives instead as a pure character signature in memory. Brian's novel, Faster Than the Speed of Love, is a title that most fans have encountered but that very few can consistently and accurately place in the show's history in terms of when it was mentioned, when it was submitted for publication, and what the specific narrative arc around it was in any given season. The novel, as a concept, is correctly held in memory as a running joke about Brian's failed literary ambitions. The specific details of its various appearances across seasons are almost never accurately tracked, because each episode handled it somewhat differently, and memory compressed those different moments into one continuous but blurry narrative of Brian failing as a novelist. Peter's extended fight sequences with recurring characters beyond Ernie the Giant Chicken are sometimes misremembered as having been more numerous than they were. The chicken fights are iconic enough to be individually memorable. Other extended fight sequences that the show attempted across various seasons are more often blended into the chicken fight memory or forgotten entirely. People sometimes remember a specific fight between Peter and a different character as having been a chicken fight, or remember the format of the chicken fight as having been used more broadly than it was. The "I'm a freaking Jedi" and similar moment of misplaced cultural reference jokes from various episodes are a class of cutaway that exists in very strong individual memory, but extremely weak episodic context. These gags, where Peter or another character makes an enthusiastic reference to something from popular culture in a way that is intentionally slightly off or absurdly placed, were among the show's most shareable clip formats. Memory of specific examples is usually quite vivid. Memory of which episode they came from, what was happening in the story when the gag appeared, and what season they occurred in is almost universally wrong. Section 8. The Ghost Episodes. Every long-running show eventually develops a mythology of episodes that people are certain they watched, but which either do not exist or exist in dramatically different forms than remembered. Family Guy, given all the factors we have examined, has accumulated more of these ghost episodes than almost any other animated program in television history. A ghost episode is a specific kind of false memory. It is not simply misremembering details of a real episode. It is the specific, detailed, confident recollection of an entire episode that either never existed as a broadcast unit or that aired in a form significantly different from what is remembered. Ghost episodes emerge from several different mechanisms, and understanding those mechanisms helps explain why they feel so utterly real to the people carrying them. The most common mechanism is episode blending. A long-running show with many episodes covering similar thematic territory creates natural pressure for memories to merge adjacent or similar episodes into composite remembered narratives. Two Season 6 episodes with similar emotional registers blend together into one remembered episode that contains elements of both. 3 different episodes where a character behaves badly in a particular way compress into one remembered episode that contains all 3 behaviors. The remembered episode feels completely real because it is assembled entirely from real components drawn from real episodes. It simply never existed as a single unit. Episode blending is especially potent in Family Guy because so many episodes share structural similarities. A large number of episodes follow the same basic architecture. Peter does something. Consequences escalate. A family member is affected. Some form of resolution or non-resolution arrives. With hundreds of episodes following variations of this structure, the specific content of any one episode can migrate to any other without the memory detecting the movement. The scaffolding is the same. The furniture was always interchangeable. The second mechanism is confabulation, where memory constructs a plausible-seeming episode from the general feel of the show rather than from actual viewing. If someone has absorbed enough of Family Guy's tone, character dynamics, and humor style, their brain can generate entirely new episode memories that feel genuine because they are consistent with everything real about the show. The confabulated memory might describe a Peter storyline that sounds completely plausible, a Brian and Stewie adventure that fits their dynamic perfectly, a cutaway gag that is exactly the kind of thing the show would have done. Everything about it reads as authentic. It simply never aired. These confabulated memories are particularly difficult to challenge because they feel, to the person holding them, exactly as real as memories of actual episodes. The challenge always sounds like you just cannot find the episode, rather than like the episode does not exist. And sometimes, of course, you cannot find an episode because it aired once in a specific time slot years ago and has been difficult to track down since. This genuine possibility of the episode existing somewhere keeps the confabulated memory protected against easy correction. The third mechanism is absorbing described episodes. Stories that circulate in fan communities about episodes, whether from online discussions, YouTube reaction content, podcast conversations, or social media threads, sometimes get misremembered as actual viewing experiences by people who read or heard about them, rather than watched them. Someone describes a particularly memorable scene from a later season episode in vivid detail. A person reads this description, builds a mental image of it, and months later remembers the mental image as a memory of watching the scene rather than as a memory of reading about it. The source of the memory has been forgotten. Only the content remains. The pulled episode mythology is one of the most persistent forms of ghost episode generation in the Family Guy community. The show has a genuine history with certain episodes being withheld or handled differently in different broadcast contexts. The episode Partial Terms of Endearment, which was produced for Season 8, dealt with surrogacy and included content touching on abortion. It was produced for American broadcast, but never aired in the United States during its original network run, instead airing in the United Kingdom and later becoming available through DVD and streaming. This real example of a withheld episode created a template in fan consciousness that gets applied to half-remembered episodes that people cannot find in normal broadcast order. People will confidently describe episodes as having been banned or pulled from rotation that were actually simply episodes they are misremembering with enough wrong details that they cannot identify them in searches. The feeling of searching for an episode and not finding it matches the feeling of searching for a banned episode and not finding it, and the more dramatic explanation tends to win out in how the experience is cataloged. The Back to the Pilot episode from Season 10, in which Brian and Stewie use the time machine to visit the events of the very first episode, creates a particular memory complication that is unusual and worth examining separately. After watching that episode, some viewers' memories of the actual pilot are partially overwritten by the Season 10 tribute to the pilot. Elements from the Season 10 version of the first episode sometimes get merged into memories of the actual first episode. The two versions of the same basic material exist in memory simultaneously, without clear separation. And when people try to recall specifics of the original pilot, they may be drawing from the later episode's interpretation rather than the original content. This is a genuinely unusual kind of memory distortion because it is caused by the show itself rather than by outside cultural factors. The show created a new version of its own first episode, and in doing so, introduced a competitor for the memory of that first episode. The newer, more recently watched version sometimes wins. DVD special features contributed to ghost episode mythology in ways that are often not accounted for in discussions of the show's memory landscape. Family Guy DVD releases included deleted scenes, extended cuts of episodes, alternate content, and in some cases, significantly different versions of broadcast episodes. Some viewers watched these extended or alternate versions and integrated them into their understanding of what the episode contained. Years later, the difference between the broadcast version and the DVD version is rarely remembered as a source category distinction. People simply have different memories of the same episode without knowing why. The syndication editing issue adds another layer. Syndicated reruns of Family Guy have been cut for time and occasionally for content standards. A scene that aired in the original network broadcast may simply not exist in the syndicated version most people encounter in reruns. When someone watches a rerun and cannot find something they clearly remember from the original airing, the experience produces exactly the sensation of a Mandela effect, even when the explanation is simply editorial cutting rather than false memory. There is a cluster of ghost episode memory, specifically around the show's holiday content. Family Guy produced multiple episodes built around holidays across its many seasons, including several distinct takes on Christmas, Halloween, and Thanksgiving. The emotional similarity of holiday episodes creates strong blending pressure. Christmas episodes from different seasons merge in memory. Halloween episodes from different eras exchange plot elements. People confidently describe a specific holiday episode with a precise plot that turns out to be a hybrid of 2 or 3 actual episodes that had superficially similar settings or themes. The Road to the North Pole two-parter from Season 9 is an episode around which memory is particularly fluid in interesting ways. The episode was genuinely darker in some of its content than typical holiday specials, including graphic sequences involving Santa Claus and reindeer that generated discussion at the time of airing. Memory of these dark sequences tends to amplify them beyond what the episode actually contained. The specific images people remember, and the specific degree of graphic content they associate with those images, are typically more extreme in the remembered version than in the actual episode. Dark content in any medium creates stronger impressions than neutral content, and those strong impressions then get further amplified by the surprise of encountering darkness in a context associated with holiday warmth. Section 9. The Supporting Cast Memory Holes. The supporting cast of Family Guy exists in a different kind of memory space than the main Griffin family, one characterized by less consistent use, more dramatic characterization shifts across seasons, and a relationship to the show's identity that makes them easier to misplace in time and context. Glenn Quagmire is the supporting character most richly associated with specific misremembered details, because his character type is so definitively fixed in the cultural memory of the show that anything inconsistent with that type tends to be filtered out rather than accurately stored. The settled cultural image of Quagmire is clear. The aggressively sexual neighbor, the source of transgressive humor built around his complete lack of moral restraint around women, the character whose catchphrase captures an entire approach to the world. This type is real and accurately describes the dominant mode of his characterization across much of the show's run. But Quagmire also had episodes that operated meaningfully outside this type. The episode dealing with his parents' gender transition and his complicated emotional response to it. The episodes where his loneliness, his genuine desire for real connection despite his behavior, was examined with something approaching authentic pathos. The speech he delivered to Brian in Jerome is the New Black, which required him to be perceptive, articulate, and emotionally precise in ways that the comedic type would not have predicted. These more complex moments sit in memory's less access storage because they do not fit the settled image, and memory is always conserving energy by defaulting to settled images rather than maintaining the full complexity of what was actually there. The episode Quagmire's Dad, from Season 8, which introduced the character of Dan Quagmire and her transition to Ida Quagmire, is one of the more significant examples of the show attempting something outside its comfort zone in terms of character representation. Memory of this episode is frequently placed in the wrong season, either pulled earlier toward the period people associate with the show's better storytelling instincts, or pushed later toward the period they associate with the show trying harder on individual character work. Joe Swanson is the character whose overall arc is most universally misremembered in a specific direction, and the direction is consistently more sympathetic than the actual content of most seasons supported. Joe was introduced in the Season 1 episode, A Hero Sits Next Door, as genuinely admirable, capable, respected, someone that the people around him, including Peter, genuinely looked up to. His use of a wheelchair was treated as one dimension of a full character, rather than as his defining characteristic. This was a thoughtful and considered choice, and it distinguished Joe from many other representations of disability in animated comedy at the time. Memory holds on to that version of Joe with considerable warmth, and it holds on to it as applying to far more of the show's run than the actual episode's support. By the middle seasons, Joe's disability had become an increasingly frequent and less carefully handled source of humor. His marriage deteriorated publicly as comedy fodder. His friends, including Peter, treated him with diminishing respect that became more pronounced over time. The admired neighbor who everyone wanted to be around slowly became a character whose limitations were used exploitatively as the show's sensibilities around such things evolved in a less careful direction. The remembered Joe is the early Joe, and this remembered version gets applied to the full run by most people who think of him fondly. The later Joe's actual characterization is filed as a deviation from the true Joe, rather than as the actual evolution of how the writers chose to use him across decades of production. Herbert the Neighbor is a character whose debut is almost universally misplaced to an earlier point in the show's history than where it actually occurred. He was introduced in the Season 2 episode To Love and Die in Dixie, which aired in 2002 during the original run. Memory almost universally places him in Season 1, because he feels foundational, because his presence in the show's identity feels as original as any character in the main cast. The feeling that he was always there, that he belongs to the earliest version of the show, overrides the factual timeline of when he actually appeared. This is a specific version of a broader pattern, where beloved recurring characters get mentally pushed back toward the beginning of the show because their presence feels so essential to what the show is that they must have been there from the start. Characters who were introduced in Season 2 or 3 feel like Season 1 characters in memory. Characters who arrived in Season 5 feel like they might have been there in Season 3. The gravitational pull of the show's foundational period reaches forward and claims things that belong to it in spirit even when they arrived later in time. Mayor Adam West carries a particular emotional weight in memory that extends beyond the show itself. Because Adam West's death in June 2017 added a layer of real-world feeling to how the character is remembered. Adam West, the actor best known for his iconic portrayal of Batman in the 1966 television series, voiced the fictional mayor Adam West across many seasons of Family Guy, playing a version of himself as a cheerfully eccentric elected official. The show paid tribute to his passing by having Mayor Adam West die in the Season 16 episode Boy Actually, which was the first season produced after West's real-life death. Memory of the character tends to generously assess how often and how prominently he appeared across the show's full run, partly because the affection for the character and the person behind it inflates the perceived significance and frequency of his appearances. He was a genuinely beloved recurring figure. His appearances were more occasional than the love for him might suggest, And the real feelings generated by the loss of Adam West as a person have merged in memory with the feelings generated by the character he played, creating a compound warmth that makes the character feel more central to the show's history than his actual episode count might objectively support. The news anchor pairing of Tom Tucker and Diane Simmons existed as such a consistently matched visual unit in the show that memory handles them as though they had parallel narrative arcs when their actual arcs were quite different from each other. Tom Tucker was primarily a comedic supporting presence who remained relatively stable across many seasons, his pompousness and obliviousness being deployed reliably for background comedy. Diane Simmons developed a significantly more complex trajectory that eventually led to an escalating storyline and her death in a season 9 episode. Memory smooths these different arcs into matched parallel tracks because the visual pairing of the two characters was so constant for so long. The Drunken Clam Bar is a setting that exists in memory with a warmth that is not entirely supported by what actually happened in most of its scenes across the full run. The early seasons established it as a place of genuine friendship, somewhere the four neighbors went to relax and be themselves. This establishing quality was real and was earned by specific scenes and specific interactions. But in the middle and later seasons, the Drunken Clam scenes were often the settings for the group's least functional dynamics, for Peter's increasing cruelty to his friends, for the diminishment of Joe's dignity, for interactions that were caustic rather than warm. Memory applies the emotional register of the early bar scenes to the later ones, because the setting is the same, the characters are the same, and the basic activity of four men sitting together drinking is the same. The warmth of the early versions bleeds into the memory of the later versions through the persistent similarity of the setting. It takes deliberate attention to the specific content of scenes to notice how much the dynamic changed, and most memory does not operate with that level of deliberateness. Section 10. Visual Mandela effects and the animation that shifted. The visual dimension of Family Guy Mandela effects is the least often discussed, but in some ways the most interesting, because changes in how characters looked accumulated slowly and continuously in ways that are genuinely perceptible when you look carefully, but that memory consistently fails to register as change. Peter Griffin's visual design drifted across the show's production history in ways that are immediately perceptible when you compare early episodes to late ones side by side, yet are almost universally invisible to people remembering the character from a single era. The early Peter, particularly in seasons 1 through 3, has a slightly different quality of physical presence on screen. His proportions have a roundness and softness that comes partly from the hand-drawn quality of that era's animation style. The outlines around his character model have a certain variability, a slight looseness from frame to frame, that made the early animation feel more alive even when it was technically rougher than what came later. The later Peter is more settled, more precisely defined, with heavier and more consistent outlines, and a more stable silhouette that reflects the more standardized production pipeline of the show's later years. These changes were not the result of deliberate redesign decisions announced and implemented at specific points. They accumulated through the production process as different animation studios handled different seasons, and as the show's visual workflow became more standardized over time. Different studios brought different sensibilities and different technical approaches to the character models, and the cumulative effect of those different approaches across seasons added up to a character who looks meaningfully different across eras, even though no single change was dramatic enough to be noticed in the moment. Memory of Peter's appearance is anchored to whichever era of the show a viewer spent the most time with, creating a situation where different generations of viewers carry genuinely different internal images of the same character. Someone who watched the show primarily in its original broadcast from 1999 through 2002 has a Peter whose visual feel is subtly but genuinely different from the Peter carried in the mind of someone who came to the show through later seasons or through streaming in recent years. Stewie's head shape is the most iconic visual element in the show's character design vocabulary. The football-shaped skull is immediately recognizable to anyone who has encountered the character for even a moment, and it is one of the most distinctive and consistent visual identifiers in all of animated television. But the exact proportions of that head, its relationship to Stewie's body, the specific angle and degree of the elongation, have not been perfectly consistent across all seasons of production. Early Stewie and late Stewie placed directly side by side would look subtly different in ways that are hard to specifically describe but easy to feel. Memory is anchored to the iconic idea of the football-shaped head, which is accurately remembered in its essential form, while the specific version of that form in any particular season blurs together with the versions from every other season. The remembered Stewie's head is a composite average across the show's full visual history rather than the head of any specific season. The Griffin family's home is a setting that exists in memory, with a sense of stability and consistency that the actual episodes do not entirely support. The exterior of the house has been depicted fairly consistently in its most general features. A white two-story house with certain landscaping and a distinctive general appearance. But the interior has been rendered with considerably less consistency across the show's run. Room layouts have changed between episodes. Hallways have appeared and disappeared depending on what a scene required. The relationship between different spaces within the house has been redrawn whenever a particular episode needed a particular spatial arrangement. The basement, the attic, the backyard, these spaces have been depicted inconsistently enough that a careful viewer who paid attention to the spatial geography of the house across many seasons would find it difficult to construct a reliable floor plan. Memory of the house is built from a composite of all these different renderings, averaged into a single settled image that feels consistent and stable but does not match any single specific version that was actually depicted. When someone says they could draw the inside of the Griffin house from memory, they are drawing from this averaged composite rather than from any single accurate depiction, and the result, if compared to any specific episode, would have details wrong. The show's animation studios across its history brought different visual qualities to the work in ways that created perceptible shifts in how characters moved and expressed themselves. The early seasons had a quality of physical expressiveness in their animation, a particular way of timing movements and reactions that created comedy through the body language and physical performances of characters as much as through their dialogue. Later seasons, particularly those handled by studios working with more standardized digital production methods, had a different quality of physical expression that was technically more polished and more consistent, but sometimes less specifically funny. Physical comedy in animation depends on timing, on the specific way a body reacts to an event, on the micro-timing of expressions. The early seasons of Family Guy had animation that committed to specific physical choices in ways that made jokes land in the body as well as in the mind. The later seasons had animation that was cleaner but sometimes more generic, making the same jokes land slightly differently or not quite as fully. This difference in how jokes landed in different eras of production is felt in the watching but rarely consciously articulated, and it contributes to the general impression that early episodes are funnier than late ones, even when the writing is comparable. Section 11. The Crossover Confusion and the Cleveland Blur. The crossover episode between Family Guy and The Simpsons, which aired the 28th of September 2014 as the Season 13 premiere, stands as perhaps the single most specifically and completely misremembered episode in the show's later history, and the reasons for that are layered in interesting ways. The episode was titled The Simpsons Guy and ran for 44 minutes, making it longer than a standard Family Guy episode. It was written by Patrick Megan and directed by Peter Shin. The concept was suggested by Family Guy executive producer Richard Apple, who had previously worked as a writer on The Simpsons for 4 seasons and retained relationships with The Simpsons creative team, including Matt Groening, James L. Brooks, and Al Jean. The episode required extensive coordination between the two shows and represented a genuine creative achievement in terms of its production complexity. Memory of which season this episode appears in is wrong at a rate that is genuinely striking. A very large number of people place it in season 10 or 11, sometimes earlier. The episode was broadcast after Family Guy had been on the air for 15 years. It exists late in the show's history by any reasonable measure, yet memory consistently pulls it forward toward the show's middle period, because the concept of a crossover with The Simpsons feels like something that would have happened when both shows were at their cultural peaks, rather than when they were significantly reduced from those peaks in terms of original broadcast viewership. The broad strokes of the plot are mostly correctly remembered. The Griffins fled their town after controversy around Peter's offensive newspaper comic strip. Their car was stolen at a gas station outside Springfield. Homer took them in. Peter and Homer fought initially over whose beer was better and then in a courtroom dispute when it was revealed that Pawtucket Patriot Ale might be an unauthorized copy of Duff beer. Lisa and Meg had a musical storyline. Stewie and Bart connected over mischief. Brian met Santa's little helper. The resolution of the Homer and Peter fight is the most consistently misremembered element of the episode, and the direction of the misremembering is almost perfectly predictable. Each viewer tends to remember the resolution in the direction that favors whichever show they were more invested in. Fans who prefer The Simpsons tend to remember Homer as having been more clearly validated or victorious. Fans who prefer Family Guy tend to remember Peter as the more capable combatant. The actual ending had both characters expressing mutual respect and agreeing to stay in their respective narrative spaces, keeping their shows a half-hour apart as they had always been. This warm but inconclusive resolution is not the kind of ending that partisan loyalty can hold accurately, and so it gets adjusted in both directions depending on who is doing the remembering. The Meg and Lisa subplot is remembered with more warmth than the episode overall received in contemporary reviews, which is consistent with how moments of genuine kindness toward Meg tend to register in memory. Lisa teaching Meg the saxophone and encouraging her that she had genuine talent and genuine worth played with particular emotional power against the background of how Meg was being treated in the show at that time. Memory preserves the warmth of that dynamic with a fidelity and a depth that the episode overall did not receive from critics. Because the emotional relevance of someone being kind to Meg registered more deeply than the episode's overall critical standing. The broader fact of American Dad airing alongside Family Guy as part of the Fox animation domination block for many years created a consistent source of memory crossover for viewers who watched both shows on the same night across the same years. Seth MacFarlane created and voiced characters in both. The shows shared superficial DNA in terms of visual style and comedic sensibility while having genuinely different characters and dramatic frameworks. For casual viewers who watched both, the specific show that a remembered scene came from is not always accurately tracked. Moments from American Dad get attributed to Family Guy, and moments from Family Guy get attributed to American Dad, with an ease that reflects how similar the viewing experience of both felt for much of their parallel run. The Cleveland show years created a specific and interesting gap in many viewers' understanding of Cleveland Brown as a character. The spin-off ran from 2009 to 2013, during which time Cleveland's primary narrative development was happening on a show that not all Family Guy viewers were watching. Family Guy viewers who did not follow Cleveland to his own show experienced his absence from Family Guy as a simple absence, a gap in a supporting character's appearances, and maintained the version of Cleveland they knew from before his departure. When Cleveland returned to Family Guy in season 13, he came back with a family and a history established during those spin-off years that the Family Guy-only audience did not share. Episodes that incorporated Cleveland's spin-off family were sometimes confusing to viewers who had not seen The Cleveland Show, and this confusion generated its own layer of memory distortion. Characters from the spin-off appeared in Family Guy and were remembered as Family Guy supporting characters by viewers who did not know where they had come from, creating false memories of the show, having developed these characters in episodes that never existed within Family Guy itself. The meta-phenomenon of thinking about crossovers and spin-offs also creates its own specific kind of memory confusion. When viewers know that a show has related programs, a spin-off, a preceding show, a crossover episode, their memory of any one of these programs becomes porous to material from the others. The knowledge that Cleveland had his own show affects how Family Guy memories of Cleveland are stored, even for viewers who never watch the spin-off. Because the awareness of the spin-off creates a sense that there is more Cleveland material out there somewhere, and this creates a fuzziness in memory about which Cleveland material belongs to which show. The show's relationship with guest voices across its long run created another category of potential memory confusion. Family Guy featured an enormous number of celebrity guest appearances across its seasons, and memory of specific guest appearances is frequently misplaced in terms of season, episode, and even sometimes character. A celebrity voice that appeared in Season 8 gets remembered as appearing in Season 5. A guest character who had one brief scene gets remembered as having a larger and more developed role. The general feeling of a celebrity's presence in the show's world sometimes persists in memory even when the specific scene or episode cannot be accurately placed. Section 12. Why our brains do this and why it is wonderful. After this long and gentle journey through misremembered quotes and blended episodes, through false memories of characters who were different from how they are remembered, and events that were undone in ways memory never quite recorded, it is worth pausing here at the end and sitting with what all of this actually means at a deeper level than just a list of corrections. The tempting reading of this material is that it is primarily about being wrong, about catching people out on errors they made in their own memories of something they loved, about proving that the confident recollection is not the accurate one. And while the specific corrections are genuinely interesting in themselves, they are not the most meaningful part of what exploring Family Guy's Mandela effects actually reveals. Memory is not a recording device and has never been one. This is something neuroscience has established clearly enough that it is no longer particularly controversial among researchers who study how the mind works, but it is something that the subjective experience of remembering makes almost impossible to fully believe at an intuitive level. When you remember something, it feels like pressing play on a video file that has been stored somewhere in the architecture of your mind. It feels like accessing footage. The vividness of a remembered experience, its apparent precision, its emotional resonance, creates a sense of reliability that feels like direct evidence of accuracy. But memory is a reconstruction. Every time you retrieve a memory, your brain rebuilds it from stored components. Emotional impressions that were recorded at the time of the original experience, associated imagery drawn from related memories, the logical shape of how the thing should have gone based on everything else you know, the social context in which you are currently retrieving the memory, and what that context expects or rewards. The reconstruction is sophisticated enough that it passes for playback in almost every normal situation. It is only when you check the reconstruction against an external record, a recording, a database, a document, that the differences become visible. For a show that ran for over 25 years, that was watched by millions of people across many different life stages and in many different contexts and states of attention, the gap between the reconstruction and the original has had enormous amounts of time and layered experience to widen. The person who watched Family Guy in 1999 was a genuinely different version of themselves than the person who currently remembers watching Family Guy in 1999. Everything that happened in the years between the original viewing and the current remembering has left marks on the memory. Other shows watched since then. Conversations about the show with friends who had their own slightly different memories. Clips encountered online that emphasized certain moments over others. Memes absorbed without consciously registering them as exposure to the show. Life events that changed the emotional frame through which everything, including old television memories, now gets filtered. A false memory of Family Guy is not a flaw in a person's mind. It is evidence of engagement. It is the trace of something that mattered enough to hold in the brain across years, preserved imperfectly because all preservation across time is imperfect. The Stewie line that got slightly elaborated in memory was worth keeping. The chicken fight that got moved to an earlier season was vivid enough that it needed a home in the foundational archive of the show's best moments. The ghost episode that was constructed by blending real scenes is a testament to how thoroughly the show's world was absorbed. There is something specifically revealing in looking at the direction of the distortions, rather than just their existence. Memory consistently makes characters more likable than they eventually became. It extends the warm, affectionate early version of the family's dynamics further forward than the actual episode's support. It places beloved running gags earlier in the show's history, pulling them toward the period remembered as the golden era. It keeps the dramatic events and loses the reversals. It preserves the emotional highlights and lets the disappointing surrounding material soften and blur. These are not random errors. They are the specific errors that affection makes when it is working with imperfect material. The remembered Peter is more consistently the lovable, well-meaning fool than the actual Peter managed to be in the middle and later seasons. The remembered Brian is the smart, loyal friend for more of the show's run than the actual character maintained. The remembered Stewie is the perfectly precise theatrical villain genius for more of the early seasons than the actual scripts always delivered. Memory is holding a best-of version of the show, assembled from its genuine moments of greatness, extended and gently idealized and preserved with the care that things only receive when they actually meant something. What Family Guy gave people across its long and complicated life was real, even when the show itself was not always at its best. It gave people characters they felt they genuinely knew. It gave them humor that caught them completely off guard and made them laugh out loud at genuinely unexpected moments. It gave them the specific, strange warmth of a family that was often awful to each other but somehow still felt like a family. It gave them Stewie and Brian's friendship, which at its best was one of the more genuinely affecting odd couple relationships in animated television across any era. It gave them years of evenings that felt like a specific kind of comfortable, familiar pleasure. The false memories are the record of that experience, imprecise in their specific details, accurate in their emotional substance, stored the way that things are always stored when they were watched in exactly the comfortable, half-distracted, gently drowsy state that is perfect for this kind of listening. This kind of late-night companionship with a show that has been around for longer than some of its viewers have been adults. There is one final thing worth saying about the Mandela effect as it applies to Family Guy specifically. The show had a genuinely difficult second half of its life, creatively speaking. The characters became less sympathetic. The humor became less sharp. The storytelling became less interested in earning its moments. This is well documented and not particularly controversial among people who watch the full run attentively. And the fact that the Mandela effects around the show consistently distort in the direction of making it better than it was, of extending the good period further than it lasted, of making the beloved characters more consistently themselves than the later seasons allowed them to be, says something genuinely moving about how people relate to things they loved. The Mandela effect here is not just memory being imprecise, it is memory being generous. It is memory doing what memory does for the things that earned real feeling, protecting the best version, maintaining the warmth, keeping the image of what the show could be and sometimes was alive in the spaces where the reality of what it became would otherwise be. So the next time someone confidently quotes Stewie wrong, or tells you with certainty that the chicken fight started in season 1, or insists that Brian was only gone for one episode and it barely counted, meet them gently in that confident misremembering. Because underneath the specific inaccuracy is a real memory of something that genuinely landed, that genuinely mattered, that someone has been carrying around in their mind through years of their life since they first encountered it. The false memory is the shape their love for the show took when the precise details faded. And that is worth considerably more than being exactly right about which season it came from. If this kind of deep, slow, unhurried exploration of something you love is what brings you here, hitting subscribe takes only a moment and means you will always have something new waiting whenever you need it. Drop a comment below letting us know which Mandela effect from tonight caught you the most off guard, whether something we covered matched a memory you had been carrying for years without knowing it was imprecise, or whether you have one of your own that we did not get to. The comments section on these long videos always becomes something rich on its own, a shared archive of what people remember from things they once loved and still do. We read every single one. Take care of yourselves out there, sleep well, and we will see you in the next one. End of script. Bonus section. The smaller details nobody can agree on. Beyond the big categories, Family Guy has generated an enormous number of smaller-scale Mandela effects that cluster around specific details, running gags, and character traits that people remember with strong conviction but frequently get wrong in ways that are illuminating. The Griffin family pet situation is one of the more interesting small-scale memory puzzles the show created. Most people know Brian is the family dog. Most people know Stewie occasionally had a goldfish or other small pets appear in scenes. What gets misremembered is the specific history of any animals beyond Brian that the family owned at various points across the show's run. There were episodes with other animals in various capacities, guest pet situations, and background details involving creatures. Memory tends to assume Brian was always the only animal in the household, because he is so completely dominant as a character that any other animal presence feels like an anomaly rather than a normal part of the show's world. The color of Meg's hat is something that exists in two firm camps of memory. Most people remember it as pink, which is correct. A meaningful minority remember it as red, which reflects either a color memory distortion common to low saturation shades in animation or a blending with other details from the character's visual design. Neither camp tends to feel uncertain. Both are confident. The pink camp is accurate, but the existence of a persistent red camp memory says something about how imprecisely specific colors register even for frequently seen characters. Peter's job history is an area of consistent false memory that touches the show's entire run. Most people remember Peter working at a brewery for most of the series, which is broadly accurate. He worked at the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery for most of the show's later seasons. But before that, in the earliest episodes, he worked at a toy factory called the Happy-Go-Lucky Toy Factory. This early job is frequently forgotten or displaced, and people who do remember it often cannot accurately place when it changed or why. The brewery feels like the definitive, foundational Peter job because it appeared in more episodes and was referenced more consistently, and memory applies it backward to cover the entire run. The identity of the voice actors behind the characters is another rich area of small-scale memory confusion. Most people know Seth MacFarlane voices Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire. Most people know Alex Borstein voices Lois. Most people know Seth Green voices Chris, and Mila Kunis voices Meg. But the less celebrated voices behind supporting characters are frequently misattributed in memory. And there is a specific and widespread false memory around Meg's voice in the very first season, which was provided by actress Lacey Chabert rather than Mila Kunis. Kunis took over the role beginning with season 2 and has voiced Meg ever since. Many people who have watched the show from the beginning have no memory of a different voice for Meg in season 1 because the change happened early enough that the Kunis version is what feels like the original. The theme song itself has generated its own cluster of small-scale Mandela effects that are worth naming. The opening theme to Family Guy, with its familiar melody and its lyrical content about where the good old-fashioned values went, is a piece of music that tens of millions of people have heard hundreds of times. And yet specific details of the lyrics, the exact sequence of lines, which character says which part, and precisely how certain phrases are worded, are frequently misremembered. People who could hum every note of the melody cannot always accurately quote the specific lyrics, and the lyrics they think they know include small variations and alterations that differ from what was actually recorded. The secondary lyrics used in the extended theme song versions, which appeared in some broadcast contexts and on DVD releases, create a specific kind of memory confusion around the theme itself. People who encountered the extended version integrated it into their mental version of the theme song alongside the broadcast version, creating a composite that does not match either the short broadcast version or the extended version exactly. Quagmire's age is a detail that the show itself treated inconsistently, making it impossible for fans to accurately remember because the source material was never consistent. Various episodes gave different ages for Quagmire, with some suggesting he was significantly older than other characters, old enough that his backstory spanned eras that should have made him impossibly ancient, given his apparent physical presentation. The show used his age selectively for jokes, without maintaining a coherent accounting. Fan memory of Quagmire's age reflects this source inconsistency. Nobody can accurately state it because the show never provided a stable answer to state accurately. The Drunken Clam as a setting is remembered as having a specific physical layout and visual appearance that is actually a composite of several slightly different versions of the bar across different seasons. The bar changed in small ways multiple times across the show's run, with different details of its interior being depicted differently depending on what a particular scene required. Memory has smoothed these various versions into a single, settled image that feels completely real and completely specific, but does not precisely match any single episode's depiction of the location. Brian's car is a detail that many fans remember but frequently misidentify in terms of make, model, and year. Brian is established as driving a specific type of car, and this car appears in various episodes. Memory of the car's exact appearance is consistently imprecise, with people often confident about one or two details while being wrong about others. The car is remembered as a symbol of Brian's character, his aspirations, his self-image, more than it is remembered as a specific vehicle with specific identifying features. The evil monkey, the character who lived in Chris's closet and pointed menacingly at him in the early seasons, is remembered by almost everyone as a more constant and more frequent presence than he actually was. His appearance was always somewhat irregular and episodic rather than truly constant, but his visual impact was strong enough that memory inflates his frequency. He was also eventually given a full backstory and resolution episode in the later seasons, which is less commonly remembered, because the original mysterious monster version of the character was more vivid and more enjoyable than the explained version. Memory keeps the unexplained pointing monster. Memory sets aside the episode where he got a full character moment and was integrated into the show's world in a conventional way. The show's relationship with real-world events, particularly around political moments and news cycles, created a category of content that aged quickly and that memory now holds with significant inaccuracy around the specific details. Episodes that referenced specific political figures or specific news events from the time they were written are remembered accurately in terms of the general subject, but the specific jokes, specific references, and specific moments within those episodes are frequently misplaced or misremembered because the cultural context that made them land has shifted so significantly that the content no longer carries the same associations it originally carried. This is a broader phenomenon that affects any comedy built substantially around topical references. The humor was time-stamped in a way that changes how it registers when retrieved years later. Memory retains the impression that an episode was topically sharp in its moment without accurately retaining the specific content that made it sharp. The feeling of the show being current and engaged with the world of its time is preserved. The specific details of what was current and what the show said about it fade into a general impression. The character of Bonnie Swanson, Joe's wife, is someone whose characterization shifted dramatically across the show's run in ways that are often not accurately remembered in terms of timing. In the early seasons, Bonnie was pregnant and remained so for an implausibly long time across multiple seasons. Her pregnancy was a running joke about the show's disregard for realism in its timeline. She eventually gave birth. Her character then developed in directions that were less sympathetic than her early characterization. Memory of Bonnie tends to hold one version or the other, either the perpetually pregnant patient wife or the later more cynical and frustrated version, without accurately holding the transition between them or its approximate timing. These smaller memory distortions, taken together with the larger ones explored throughout the rest of this long late-night conversation, paint a picture of a show that lived in its audience with enormous specificity and enormous imprecision simultaneously. People know it deeply in ways that do not always correspond to what was actually there. They remember it fondly in ways that are shaped as much by what they wanted it to be as by what it was. They quote it confidently in ways that reflect the passage of the words through years of retelling rather than the original recording. This is what it means for a piece of art or entertainment to truly live in someone. Not to be filed away accurately and retrieved on demand, but to be absorbed and metabolized and kept in the kind of living, changing, imperfect storage that human beings use for everything that actually matters to them. The things we remember imperfectly are the things we remember at all. The rest passes through without leaving anything worth keeping. Family Guy left things worth keeping. Even when the specifics got rearranged, even when the details came back scrambled, even when the quote arrived with extra words that were never there. The feeling underneath all of that imprecision is real, and was real when it was first created, which is the only thing that was ever worth holding onto in the first place. Sleep well. We will be here whenever you need something to drift off to. End of script. Total runtime estimate. Approximately 2 hours 15 minutes at natural narration pace. A final note on memory and meaning. There is one more thing worth saying before we close out this exploration completely, and it is about the specific experience of watching a long-running show like this one across your life, rather than all at once. When you watch a show like Family Guy over the course of 2 decades, you are not really watching the same show at each sitting. The person who watched Season 1 in 1999, or caught the reruns on Adult Swim in 2003, was at a different point in their life than the person who watched the revival seasons in 2005, or caught up on streaming in 2015 or 2020. The show absorbed into a different set of experiences, different emotional frameworks, different references and contexts, at each different point of engagement. What you carried away from watching it at 16 is not the same thing you carried away from watching it at 25 or 35. This means that any single person's memory of Family Guy is already a composite of multiple different viewing relationships across time, not a single unified experience being stored. The person remembering the show is layering memories from their 16-year-old self, their 20-year-old self, their 30-year-old self, all of whom watched the same show at different life moments and took different things from it. These layered memories blend together rather than stacking neatly, which is another rich source of the Mandela effects we have been exploring. The early seasons feel so strongly like the real, essential, foundational Family Guy, partly because most people who love the show encountered those seasons when they were young, and things experienced young tend to be encoded with particular vividness and particular permanence. The later seasons, watched at an older age, with more competing demands on attention and memory, simply did not encode with the same depth. This is another way of saying that the golden era mythology around the show is not just about the quality of those seasons, though quality was genuinely higher. It is also about the age at which people encountered them and the kind of encoding that age produces. Memory of television, like memory of music, or memory of any art that reaches us at a formative moment, is partly a memory of who we were when we encountered it. And that is why correcting the specific details of those memories carries a slightly wistful quality even when the corrections are entirely accurate. You are not just correcting a fact. You are gently touching the record of a specific person at a specific time who experienced something and found it worth keeping. Be gentle with those records. They are worth more than precision. Good night. The show gave something to a lot of people over a very long time. The Mandela effects it generated are the measure of that gift. Every misremembered detail is a small monument to genuine engagement. Every confidently wrong quote is a record of a moment that mattered enough to keep. Every blended episode is proof that the world those characters inhabited felt real and worth inhabiting. The false memories are the most honest thing about how people relate to Family Guy, because they are unguarded in a way that deliberate analysis never quite is. They are what stuck, what stayed, what traveled through the years and came back up when someone asked. And that, more than any accurate account of seasons and episode numbers and precise wordings, is what the show actually was. Good night, everyone. Take care of yourselves.